The night a billionaire chose a homeless girl, the city laughed before it listened. Rain rolled down the glass walls of the Ashcroft Grand Hotel, turning the glittering skyline into streaks of silver and gold. Luxury sedans lined the entrance as reporters adjusted their cameras beneath rows of white umbrellas, waiting for America's most mysterious billionaire to arrive. Nathaniel Ashcroft rarely appeared in public. Rumors followed him everywhere. Some claimed he never aged. Others whispered that he never attended events unless every detail had been personally approved. Tonight, however, was different. The annual charity gala promised to gather the wealthiest families in the state, celebrities, business leaders, and politicians beneath one magnificent ballroom ceiling. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected thousands of tiny lights across polished marble floors while an orchestra filled the room with elegant music. Every guest wore custom designer clothing worth more than many families earned in a year. Conversations revolved around investments, influence, and appearances. Outside the gates, only a few feet away, another world existed. Emma Brooks stood beneath the edge of an old bus shelter with a worn gray coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her shoes had survived one winter too many, and the cold rain soaked through the fabric faster than she could brush it away. She was hungry, exhausted, and invisible to nearly everyone entering the gala. Yet when an elderly veteran struggled to gather the groceries that had spilled across the wet sidewalk, Emma immediately stepped into the rain without hesitation. She knelt beside him, carefully placing every can and loaf of bread back into the shopping bag before helping him stand with a gentle smile. The old man thanked her and offered the few dollars remaining in his pocket. Emma quietly shook her head. "You need it more than I do," she said before returning beneath the shelter. She never noticed the black limousine that had stopped across the street. Behind its tinted window, crimson eyes watched every moment in complete silence. Nathaniel Ashcroft had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Wealth attracted admiration that often disappeared the moment generosity ended. Tonight he had expected another evening of practiced smiles and carefully rehearsed conversations. Instead, he found himself unable to look away from the young woman who had refused money she desperately needed. His driver waited for instructions. The security team prepared the usual entrance. Cameras flashed as guests turned toward the limousine, expecting the city's richest bachelor to emerge. Nathaniel remained seated for several long seconds, watching Emma tuck her cold hands into her sleeves while quietly sharing half of the sandwich she had been saving with a trembling stray dog that wandered near the shelter. She smiled at the animal before taking the smallest remaining bite for herself. Something inside Nathaniel shifted with unexpected certainty. He opened the limousine door and stepped into the rain. Every camera immediately followed him as reporters shouted his name. Instead of walking toward the grand entrance, he crossed the sidewalk in the opposite direction. Conversations inside the ballroom faded as guests gathered near the towering windows to see where the billionaire was going. Emma looked up only when polished black shoes stopped a few feet away. She blinked in surprise, unaware that the quiet stranger standing before her was the most powerful man in the city. Nathaniel met her eyes with calm sincerity, ignoring the stunned silence spreading across the crowd behind him. For the first time in decades, he smiled before speaking the words that would change both of their lives forever. Emma stared at the man standing before her, convinced he had mistaken her for someone else. Rain continued to fall between them, soft enough to blur the city lights but steady enough to keep everyone watching from a distance. Nathaniel Ashcroft did not seem bothered by the weather or by the hundreds of curious eyes following his every movement. His black overcoat remained perfectly tailored despite the wind, and his unusually pale face carried a calm expression that felt almost impossible to read. He held out a simple business card instead of money. Emma hesitated before accepting it. The heavy paper carried only his name and a single address. There was no slogan, no company logo, no promise of fortune. She looked back at him with cautious confusion. "I think you have the wrong person," she said quietly. Nathaniel answered with a gentle shake of his head. I have spent years meeting people who know my name, he replied. Tonight I wanted to meet someone who does not care about it. His words were so unexpected that Emma could not think of an answer. Around them, camera flashes lit the sidewalk like distant lightning. Reporters whispered into microphones while wealthy guests watched through enormous glass windows, unable to understand why the city's most influential businessman remained outside speaking with a homeless woman instead of attending his own charity gala. Nathaniel glanced toward the ballroom only briefly before returning his attention to Emma. "Would you join me for dinner?" he asked. She almost laughed, believing it had to be some elaborate joke. "I cannot afford a place like that," she answered honestly. "Neither can the people inside," Nathaniel said with a faint smile. "Many of them only rent the appearance." Emma studied his face, searching for mockery, but found none. She had learned long ago that kindness offered without a reason usually came with hidden conditions. Every shelter had rules. Every favor carried expectations. Every smiling stranger eventually wanted something in return. Yet the man before her simply waited without pressure, giving her all the time she needed. She looked down at her weathered coat, embarrassed by the rain stains and worn sleeves. "I do not belong in there," she whispered. Nathaniel followed her gaze before removing his own umbrella from the driver who had quietly approached. Instead of covering himself, he placed it gently into Emma's hands. "Then we will find somewhere you do feel comfortable," he said. The simple gesture stunned everyone watching. Reporters had expected a publicity photograph, perhaps a generous donation or a symbolic handshake. Instead, they watched one of the richest men in America stand calmly in the rain while the homeless woman remained dry beneath his umbrella. The cameras captured every second, but none of them understood the quiet meaning behind the moment. Nathaniel had not offered charity. He had offered dignity. Emma tightened her fingers around the umbrella handle, still uncertain why this stranger treated her with such respect. "Why me?" she finally asked. Nathaniel looked toward the crowded ballroom filled with polished smiles before answering in a voice barely louder than the falling rain. "Because when no one believed anyone was watching, you chose kindness anyway." Those words settled into Emma's heart with unexpected weight. For the first time in many years, someone had noticed not what she had lost, but who she had remained. As the city continued to stare in disbelief, Nathaniel quietly turned away from the grand entrance and began walking toward a small neighborhood diner glowing warmly just 2 blocks away, leaving the most expensive celebration in the city behind without looking back. The little neighborhood diner smelled of fresh coffee, warm bread, and cinnamon instead of expensive perfume and polished marble. A small bell chimed softly as Nathaniel opened the door, allowing Emma to step inside first. The waitress behind the counter looked up with a welcoming smile before freezing in complete surprise. She recognized the man immediately. Almost everyone in the city did. Yet instead of requesting a private table or special treatment, Nathaniel quietly guided Emma toward the corner booth beside a rain-covered window where ordinary families usually shared breakfast. Outside, traffic continued moving through the wet streets while reporters slowly realized they had followed the wrong story. The grand charity gala no longer mattered. Every camera now searched for the small diner where the billionaire had disappeared. Emma carefully removed the borrowed umbrella and placed it beside the booth before looking around the cozy room. Old photographs covered the brick walls, and soft country music played through hidden speakers. Steam drifted from the kitchen where fresh pie cooled beside rows of homemade rolls. Everything felt honest. Everything felt real. Nathaniel sat across from her without saying a word until the waitress approached with 2 glasses of water. She nervously handed him a menu. He smiled politely and handed both menus to Emma instead. "You choose," he said. Emma looked down, embarrassed by the prices even though they were simple compared to the luxury hotel they had left behind. Nathaniel noticed her hesitation. "Order what you actually want," he said gently. "Not what you think you should choose." She studied the menu for another moment before selecting tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. Nathaniel ordered exactly the same meal. Emma looked up in surprise. "You could eat anywhere in the city," she said. Nathaniel folded his hands together on the table. "I often do," he admitted. "Very few places feel like people actually belong there." Silence settled comfortably between them. It did not feel awkward. Rain tapped softly against the window while nearby families continued their conversations, paying little attention after the initial excitement faded. Emma finally asked the question that had been sitting in her mind since he approached her outside the gala. "Why did you really leave your own event?" Nathaniel watched the raindrops slowly race each other down the glass before answering. "Because I have attended hundreds of charity dinners," he said quietly. "People speak beautifully about helping strangers while never seeing the person standing 10 feet away." Emma lowered her eyes. She understood that feeling better than anyone. "Being invisible becomes normal after a while," she admitted. Nathaniel looked directly at her. "You were never invisible," he replied. "People simply chose not to look." The waitress returned carrying 2 steaming bowls of soup and freshly toasted sandwiches. Before Emma could reach for the spoon, Nathaniel quietly thanked the waitress by name. She smiled with genuine surprise. After she walked away, Emma asked how he knew her. Nathaniel answered simply. "She has worked here for 12 years. Every person deserves to be remembered." Emma stared at him for several seconds, slowly realizing that the man sitting across from her was nothing like the cold billionaire described by newspapers and television. His wealth appeared enormous, but his attention rested on the smallest details most people ignored. Outside, camera flashes reflected faintly through the rain-covered window, yet Nathaniel never once looked toward them. His focus remained entirely on the woman sharing an ordinary meal across the table. Emma felt something unfamiliar begin replacing the caution she had carried for years. It was not trust. Not yet. But for the first time in a very long time, hope quietly found an empty seat beside her. Morning sunlight filtered gently through the diner windows as the storm clouds finally drifted away, leaving tiny drops of water sparkling on parked cars outside. Emma had not realized how long they had been talking until the breakfast crowd slowly disappeared and the waitress quietly refilled their coffee cups without being asked. The conversation had never felt forced. Nathaniel spoke little about business, and even less about himself. Instead, he asked Emma about the books she enjoyed reading before life became difficult, about the places she dreamed of visiting, and about the kind of work that once made her feel proud. No one had asked those questions in years. Most people wanted to know why she had become homeless. Nathaniel wanted to know who she had been before that happened. Emma admitted she had once hoped to become a librarian because she believed every book gave someone another chance to imagine a different future. Nathaniel smiled softly. "Perhaps that dream has only been waiting," he said. Before Emma could answer, a sleek black sedan quietly stopped outside the diner. A man in an immaculate charcoal suit stepped inside with careful posture. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his expression remained professional despite the obvious concern in his eyes. He approached Nathaniel respectfully. "Sir," he said in a calm voice, "the board has been attempting to reach you for nearly 2 hours. Every news network is broadcasting last night's photographs. Investors are requesting explanations, and the executive meeting begins in 45 minutes." Nathaniel looked at his watch only briefly before returning his attention to Emma. "Please inform the board that I will not be attending," he answered. The assistant hesitated for the first time. "Sir, the acquisition vote cannot proceed without your approval." Nathaniel folded his napkin neatly beside his empty plate. "Then they will have to postpone it." The assistant nodded, although surprise briefly crossed his face before he quietly left the diner. Emma stared across the table in disbelief. "You just cancelled a meeting because of breakfast?" she asked. Nathaniel gently shook his head. "No," he replied. "I postponed a meeting because a conversation mattered more." Emma looked down at her coffee cup, unsure how to respond. She had spent years believing powerful people measured every minute by profit. Nathaniel seemed to measure time differently. He noticed people before schedules. Silence settled comfortably once again until Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a small brass key on the table. Emma looked at it with confusion. "There is a furnished apartment above one of my neighborhood libraries," he explained. "It has remained empty for several months. You may stay there for as long as you need." Emma immediately pushed the key back toward him. "I cannot accept something that expensive," she said firmly. "I do not want charity." Nathaniel did not move the key. Instead, he reached into another pocket and placed a folded sheet of paper beside it. Emma opened it carefully. It was not a gift agreement. It was a job application. The position listed was library assistant. Flexible hours. Full salary. Employee housing included during the probation period. Emma read every line twice before looking up in complete surprise. "You are offering me work," she whispered. Nathaniel nodded. "Everyone deserves an opportunity to stand on their own feet," he said. "I am simply opening a door. Walking through it is entirely your choice." Emma held the paper with trembling hands. For years, strangers had offered pity. Some had offered loose change. Others had offered advice. No one had offered respect. Outside the diner, the morning sun grew brighter, washing away the last traces of rain. Neither of them noticed the black luxury vehicle parked quietly across the street, where an unfamiliar passenger watched the diner through darkened glass with careful interest, already deciding that Emma Brooks had become far more important than anyone had expected. The quiet apartment above the neighborhood library overlooked a tree-lined street where children rode bicycles after school and neighbors greeted one another by name. Emma stood beside the living room window with the brass key still resting in her palm, almost afraid to believe the place was real. The apartment was simple rather than extravagant. A comfortable sofa faced a shelf filled with classic novels. Fresh flowers stood on the kitchen table beside a handwritten welcome note that contained no signature. The refrigerator held ordinary groceries instead of luxury items, and a warm reading lamp waited beside a small armchair overlooking the street below. Everything felt prepared for someone to begin again rather than someone to impress. Emma slowly walked through each room before stopping in front of the bedroom mirror. For the first time in many months, she saw herself standing in a place that felt safe. The next morning she arrived at the library carrying the neatly folded job application Nathaniel had given her. The building itself was older than most downtown offices, with red brick walls, polished oak floors, and sunlight pouring through tall windows onto rows of carefully organized books. The librarian, Mrs. Evelyn Harper, greeted her with a smile that carried neither pity nor surprise. "We have been expecting you," she said warmly. Emma hesitated. "You already knew?" Mrs. Harper nodded. "Mr. Ashcroft never asks us to hire someone. He only recommends people he believes deserve an opportunity." Emma spent the morning learning how to organize returned books, assist visitors, and help children find stories suited to their reading level. The work felt strangely familiar, as though a forgotten dream had quietly awakened. She noticed that nearly every employee spoke about Nathaniel with genuine respect rather than fear. They described him as someone who remembered birthdays, visited libraries without photographers, and personally funded literacy programs in neighborhoods that most wealthy investors ignored. None of them mentioned expensive cars or towering office buildings. They spoke instead about kindness performed so quietly that many people never realized who had made it possible. During lunch, Emma walked through the second floor, where framed photographs displayed decades of community events. One picture immediately caught her attention. It showed Nathaniel standing at the back of a crowded room almost 15 years earlier during the opening of the very same library. He looked exactly the same. The same pale face. The same calm crimson eyes. The same dark hair. Emma leaned closer, convinced the photograph had been edited or restored from a much more recent event. Mrs. Harper noticed her expression and quietly joined her. "Remarkable photograph, is not it?" she said with a knowing smile. Emma looked back at the date engraved beneath the frame. It was authentic. "He does not seem any older," Emma whispered. Mrs. Harper simply adjusted the picture until it hung perfectly straight. "Some people carry time differently," she replied before returning to her desk. The answer settled into Emma's thoughts without explaining anything. That evening, as the library prepared to close, Nathaniel arrived carrying a small cardboard box filled with donated children's books. He wore an ordinary dark sweater instead of an expensive suit, and several children immediately ran toward him, excited to show the stories they had borrowed that week. He knelt to their height, listening carefully as each child proudly described favorite characters and adventures. Emma watched from across the room, realizing that not one of the children seemed intimidated by one of the richest men in America. To them, he was simply the quiet man who always remembered their names. As Nathaniel looked up and their eyes met across the library, Emma smiled without thinking. It was the first completely unguarded smile she had shared in years. Neither of them noticed the unfamiliar man standing outside across the street, speaking quietly into a phone while watching the library entrance with growing interest, convinced that the mysterious connection between Nathaniel Ashcroft and Emma Brooks was hiding a secret worth uncovering. Several quiet weeks passed, and the rhythm of Emma's new life slowly replaced the uncertainty that had once followed every sunrise. Each morning she unlocked the library doors before the first visitors arrived, arranged returned books across polished oak shelves, and welcomed children who rushed toward their favorite reading corner with excited smiles. She no longer counted the hours until the next meal or searched for a dry place to sleep. Instead, she learned the names of regular visitors, recommended novels to curious teenagers, and listened patiently as older neighbors shared stories that were almost as valuable as the books themselves. Nathaniel visited often, but never according to a schedule. Sometimes he carried donated books in plain cardboard boxes. Other times he quietly repaired loose shelves before anyone noticed they needed attention. He never arrived with photographers, assistants, or security surrounding him. The children simply waved and called his name as though greeting an old friend. Emma began noticing something else as well. Whenever Nathaniel entered the library, conversations briefly paused. Adults smiled with sincere respect, but a few strangers watched him with expressions that were much harder to understand. Curiosity mixed with suspicion followed him wherever he went. One afternoon, after the library closed, Emma found Mrs. Harper carefully organizing several dusty storage boxes in the archive room. Together they sorted old newspapers, donation records, and photographs documenting decades of community history. While placing a framed article onto a shelf, Emma suddenly stopped. The newspaper was dated more than 30 years earlier. Across the front page stood a photograph of Nathaniel attending the opening of a children's literacy center. He looked exactly as he did today. The same pale face. The same calm smile. The same dark hair. Even his clothing seemed strangely timeless. Emma slowly reached for another newspaper from 20 years later. Nathaniel appeared again at another charity event. Unchanged. A third article showed him standing beside the mayor during a hospital expansion nearly 40 years earlier. Still unchanged. Mrs. Harper noticed the growing confusion on Emma's face but continued arranging the archive with practiced calm. "You have questions," she said softly. Emma nodded. "How is this possible?" she whispered. Mrs. Harper rested one hand upon the old newspaper before answering with careful honesty. "There are many stories people tell about Nathaniel Ashcroft," she said. "Some are invented. Some are exaggerated. A few are surprisingly close to the truth. But none of those stories explain the man himself." Emma looked once more at the photograph spread across the table. "Does he ever talk about his past?" she asked. Mrs. Harper smiled gently. "Only when someone asks for understanding instead of gossip." That evening, Emma remained in the library after everyone else had gone home. Outside, the setting sun painted warm orange reflections across the windows while quiet shadows stretched between the bookshelves. She carefully returned the newspapers to their boxes, yet her thoughts refused to settle. Nathaniel had changed her life without asking for anything in return. He had offered work instead of pity, respect instead of sympathy, and hope instead of promises. Yet an entire part of his own life remained hidden behind an impossible mystery. As she switched off the final reading lamp and prepared to leave, she noticed a small envelope resting neatly on the circulation desk. Her name was written across the front in elegant handwriting she immediately recognized. Inside rested a single invitation, printed on thick ivory paper. It requested her presence for dinner at Ashcroft Manor the following evening. Beneath the invitation, Nathaniel had written one brief sentence in dark ink. "There are truths that should only be shared face to face." Emma folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket, unaware that accepting the invitation would lead her beyond the ordinary world she thought she understood and into the extraordinary secret Nathaniel had carried alone for longer than anyone could imagine. The following evening arrived beneath a sky painted with soft shades of gold and deep blue as Emma stood before the tall iron gates of Ashcroft Manor, holding the invitation more tightly than she realized. The estate stretched across rolling green hills just outside the city, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose branches seemed to guard generations of quiet memories. Unlike the extravagant mansions often displayed in magazines, the property felt peaceful rather than overwhelming. Stone pathways wound through carefully maintained gardens, fountains reflected the fading sunlight, and warm lights glowed behind tall windows as though the house had been waiting for guests instead of admiration. A butler greeted Emma with genuine courtesy and escorted her through a grand entrance hall lined not with expensive paintings of famous collectors but with landscapes, family portraits, and shelves filled with well-read books. The air carried the faint scent of cedar wood and fresh flowers instead of polished luxury. Nathaniel waited inside the library, standing beside a fireplace where quiet flames danced across carved stone. He wore a simple black suit without a tie, looking more like a thoughtful professor than one of the wealthiest men in America. When Emma entered, he offered a warm smile that immediately eased the nervousness she had carried throughout the drive. "Thank you for coming," he said. Emma glanced around the room before answering honestly. "I almost did not." Nathaniel nodded as though he had expected that answer. "Questions are easier to avoid than answers," he replied. Dinner was served in a small dining room overlooking the gardens instead of the enormous banquet hall Emma had imagined. Only two place settings rested on the polished oak table. Fresh bread, roasted vegetables, homemade soup, and baked salmon had been prepared with quiet elegance rather than unnecessary extravagance. They spoke about ordinary things at first. Emma described the children who visited the library every afternoon and the elderly gentleman who insisted on returning every mystery novel exactly 1 week after borrowing it. Nathaniel listened carefully, smiling more than speaking, asking thoughtful questions that revealed he remembered details from previous conversations. After dinner, he led Emma through a quiet hallway into a sunlit conservatory where moonlight now filtered through glass panels overhead. Hundreds of white orchids filled the room with gentle fragrance. Emma immediately recognized the flowers from the greenhouse she had once dreamed of visiting while reading about historic estates. Nathaniel stopped beside one blooming orchid and gently touched one of its petals. "These flowers survive because they receive exactly what they need," he said softly. "Not because they receive everything." Emma looked at him with growing curiosity. "You invited me here to tell me the truth," she reminded him. Nathaniel remained silent for several long moments. His crimson eyes reflected the moonlight with unusual brightness, yet there was no fear in them, only quiet acceptance. "Many years ago," he began, "I realized that people often become afraid the moment they discover what I truly am." Emma felt her heartbeat quicken, but she did not step away. Nathaniel slowly removed a small silver locket from his pocket and placed it into her hands. Inside rested an old photograph taken more than a century earlier. Nathaniel stood among a family dressed in clothing from another era, looking exactly as he did today. Emma carefully closed the locket without speaking. Suddenly every impossible newspaper photograph, every unchanged portrait, and every unanswered question settled into a single undeniable truth. Nathaniel finally met her eyes and spoke with complete honesty. "Emma," he said quietly, "I was born long before anyone alive today can remember. I am a vampire." The conservatory fell completely silent except for the gentle sound of water flowing through a nearby fountain as Emma stood motionless, not because she feared the man before her, but because she finally understood why loneliness had followed him for far longer than any human heart should ever have to endure. Emma did not answer immediately. She looked down at the antique locket resting quietly in her hands while the moonlight shimmered across its worn silver edges. Every impossible detail she had noticed over the past several weeks suddenly fit together with perfect clarity. The unchanged newspaper photographs. The decades of community projects. The quiet mystery surrounding Nathaniel's past. None of it frightened her as much as the loneliness hidden behind his calm voice. Nathaniel did not step closer. He did not ask her to believe him. He simply waited, giving her the same freedom he had offered from the very first moment they met beneath the rain outside the hotel. Finally, Emma lifted her eyes and spoke with complete honesty. "You are still the man who thanked the waitress by name," she said softly. "You are still the man who offered me work instead of pity. Nothing about those moments has changed." Nathaniel looked at her with quiet surprise. "You are not afraid?" he asked. Emma considered the question carefully before answering. "I have met people who looked ordinary and treated others without kindness. I have also met someone who has lived for longer than I can imagine and still chooses compassion every single day. I know which one deserves my trust." A faint smile appeared across Nathaniel's face, small enough that many people might have missed it, yet it carried more relief than joy. He slowly walked toward one of the tall glass walls overlooking the gardens. Beyond the orchids, the moon illuminated rows of ancient oak trees stretching across the estate. "For more than a century," he said quietly, "I have hidden who I am because fear spreads faster than truth. Wealth protects my privacy, but it cannot replace ordinary companionship." Emma joined him beside the window. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence felt peaceful instead of uncomfortable. Somewhere outside, a fountain flowed steadily through the night, its gentle rhythm filling the conservatory with calm. Nathaniel finally continued. "I did not invite you here because I expected acceptance. I invited you because you deserved honesty before our friendship became anything more." Emma rested one hand against the cool glass while looking toward the gardens below. "Friendship built on truth lasts longer than kindness built on secrets," she replied. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "That is exactly what I hoped someone would one day say." Before either of them could continue, a quiet knock sounded at the conservatory door. Nathaniel's longtime assistant entered with unusual hesitation, carrying a sealed envelope marked confidential. "I apologize for interrupting," he said respectfully. "This could not wait until morning." Nathaniel opened the envelope and calmly read its contents. His expression remained composed, but Emma noticed his eyes become noticeably more serious. He handed her the letter without a word. It contained several photographs taken outside the library, outside the apartment, and even outside Ashcroft Manor earlier that evening. Someone had been following both of them for days. Attached to the photographs was a short and signed message. "Some secrets belong to history. If you continue together, the whole city will learn the truth." Emma lowered the letter and looked toward Nathaniel. Instead of fear, she saw quiet disappointment cross his face. "I had hoped to keep you far away from this burden," he admitted. Emma folded the photographs carefully before placing them back inside the envelope. "You did not choose this burden alone," she said gently. "And you should not have to carry it alone now." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment as though hearing those words for the very first time in his long life. Outside, the night remained perfectly still, but somewhere beyond the estate gates, someone else was already preparing to force the hidden truth into the light. Morning arrived with clear skies and gentle sunlight spreading across the city, yet the quiet peace carried a new sense of purpose. Nathaniel stood in his office overlooking the streets below while the anonymous letter rested unopened on his desk. For the first time in many decades, he no longer felt compelled to hide behind silence alone. Emma arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying a small stack of library books she had promised to deliver to a neighborhood reading program. She smiled as she entered the room, and Nathaniel realized that hope could appear as naturally as daylight. "I have been thinking," Emma said softly. "Fear grows in darkness. Truth grows where people can see it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment before slowly nodding. Together they drove to the neighborhood library instead of holding a press conference or issuing a carefully prepared statement. The reading room filled with children, parents, teachers, and longtime volunteers who had gathered for the weekly community story hour. Nathaniel helped arrange chairs while Emma organized books across colorful tables. Nothing about the morning felt extraordinary, yet everything about it reflected the lives they had chosen. Before the event began, Nathaniel stepped forward with quiet confidence. "Many people have questions about me," he said calmly. "Some stories are true. Some are not. What matters most is not how long I have lived, but how I choose to live each day." The room remained completely silent. He did not speak about wealth. He did not defend himself. He simply spoke about responsibility, compassion, and the belief that every person deserved dignity regardless of circumstance. Emma stood beside him, not because she had been asked to, but because she wanted to. When someone nervously asked whether she regretted trusting him, Emma answered without hesitation. "The first thing he ever offered me was respect. Everything else came after that." Those simple words spread far beyond the library walls. Reporters who had expected scandal instead found a story about kindness. Neighbors who had repeated old rumors began sharing memories of scholarships, hospitals, libraries, and shelters quietly funded over generations. The anonymous photographs gradually lost their power because there was no longer a secret powerful enough to divide people who had witnessed genuine character with their own eyes. Weeks later, the library expanded its community programs with support from the Ashcroft Foundation. The once empty apartment above the library became temporary housing for people rebuilding their lives, while new reading rooms opened across the city. Emma accepted a permanent position as community outreach director, helping others find opportunities instead of charity. Nathaniel continued visiting without ceremony, carrying donated books through the front door just as he always had. The children still greeted him with laughter instead of fear. One quiet evening, after the library closed, Emma and Nathaniel stood outside beneath the soft glow of the porch lights as autumn leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk. Neither of them needed to fill the silence with unnecessary words. The journey that had begun beneath cold rain had led them to something far stronger than fortune or mystery. Nathaniel looked toward the warm lights shining through the library windows before quietly saying, "I spent more than a century searching for someone who could see beyond what I am." Emma smiled as she looked back at the people inside arranging books for the next morning. "You were never waiting to be understood," she replied. "You were waiting to be known." The evening breeze carried the sound of children laughing somewhere down the street, and for the first time in longer than memory itself, the immortal vampire no longer felt alone, because the greatest gift he had ever received was never endless life, but one ordinary human heart willing to choose kindness over fear.